The lounge smelled like old money and cigarette smoke, a heavy perfume of cedar and ice, and the faint metallic tang that comes from polished brass and unfinished bargains. Light pooled in corners like dark syrup, reflecting off crystal and the satin of someone's cuff. My fingers curled around a cheap paper cup as if it were an anchor, the heat of my palm making the cardboard soft and unacceptable. I pressed my thumb against the tiny sticker on my wrist, the adhesive warm from my skin, and held it there until my pulse slowed enough to count. The room was a map of power, every face a territory marked by posture and scale. I had learned to read the margins, to know which chairs were for smile and which were for verdict. From where I stood, in a dress that had cost more than my rent, the entire room watched without moving, eyes measuring what I might be worth, or what I might cost them. The doors opened, and a cold wind carried in a new scent, raw and confusing, like rain on asphalt and pine sap. Heads turned. A man entered whose presence sank into the floor and made even the lighting rearrange itself. For a second my chest cleaved with the urge to run, to slip back into the alleys that knew my pace. Instead, I did something reflexive and foolish. My ex stepped into my path, voice smooth and sharp, asking a question that had only one acceptable answer in that circle. Panic felt physical, a graze along my spine. I looked past him, and my hand landed on a stranger, warm and solid, and I took it to pull myself out. It was a simple act of escape, nothing cinematic, but as my fingers closed over his, I felt a pressure settle around us both, like a net. He squeezed back once, quick and sure, and the noise in the room collapsed into a hum. I was not thinking about what his hand meant. I was thinking about flight. I did not know then that I had taken the hand of a man who walked funerals like a landlord walks his properties. I did not, in that moment, comprehend the price that would arrive with his protection. The conversation that followed was economy of danger. My ex, who had always been good at the measurements of hurt, made a joke that pressed, asking whether I intended to make a scene. The man who had offered his hand answered for me without an introduction, voice low and even like a warning under a lullaby. We moved through a crowd that smelled of lacquered wood and stale perfume, the stranger's coat brushing my arm with a scent that would later become a refrain, a mix of smoke and pine that seemed to hold against other scents like an exclamation. The stranger's name was not offered, but everyone seemed to know him by tilt and lack of surprise. There were people in the room who slid away with practiced faces, and one of them, a woman with a clipboard and eyes that catalogued what could be bought, shot a look at him that was half reverence and half calculation. In my palm, the sticker peeled at one corner, the adhesive failing like a promise. I thought of the boy I had been keeping under my roof for the last year, a small, stubborn thing who had learned to sleep with one ear tuned to footsteps. I thought of the envelope of school fees tucked into a sock drawer. I thought of the small stuffed fox he called Mr. Fox, missing an eye and smelling faintly of drywall. Panic is an efficient translator. It made the stranger a potential bastion. I clung to him for shelter, and shelter, as it turned out, came with orders. We did not leave the city that night. We left the building as a pair of silhouettes, the stranger guiding me toward a car waiting under a streetlight like an animal at the edge of a field. He did not ask my name. He did not offer anything but direction, and a place between his shoulder and the doorframe where my breath was a contained thing. He spoke seldom. Each word counted. At the curb, a driver with a clean face and hands that betrayed patience bowed as if to a lord, and the stranger accepted the bow like a currency. When my ex followed, voice ricocheting through the night, asking what right he had to remove me, the stranger answered in a tone that made the air hard. He said one sentence that folded the street in on itself, and my ex retreated, intact enough to lick his wounds and rich enough to afford having done so. I felt guilty for the ease with which the man had protected me. He must have known what he was offering. He must have known what I was worth to those who wanted to take pieces of me. The car smelled of cedar and the cold undertone that had clung to the stranger like a personal weather. He finally looked at me in the low light, and his eyes were a kind of dark timber, precise and unreadable. He asked who I was, not with curiosity, but with a clerk-like acknowledgement that certain things needed to be recorded. I told him my name. He nodded the way someone files a form. He asked about the boy. His voice softened briefly when I mentioned him, and for a quarter of a breath I saw the outline of a man who could be tender without meaning to be. He said nothing further, only folded a paper map between his fingers and told the driver an address 2 neighborhoods over. The world outside moved in its usual rhythm of horns and late-night deliveries and the smell of frying oil. Inside the car there was an inventory being made, quietly and without fanfare. He did not promise me protection with words. He demonstrated it with movement, with the placement of his hand on my knee for a moment when the car hit a pothole, as if to say, "I will keep you upright." That small, unsolicited gesture burned like a seal. I did not yet know his name, his title, the alphabet soup of loyalties that trailed him. But I knew the shape of what I had asked for. The first morning in his building felt like entering a different climate. The hallway smelled like lemon cleaning solution and old wood, a contrast to the smoke and velvet of the lounge. The elevator hummed, and the man who had been a stranger now arranged my life with a methodical grace, directing a young woman with a clipboard to retrieve my coat and the shoes I had lost in the exit. Her name was Leela, and she introduced herself with the precision of someone used to inventories. She had a paper tag on her blouse with the word "logistic" written beneath it. Inside the apartment, light came in thin slats through blinds and painted the floors in neat stripes. The space felt curated, not ostentatious, like someone had chosen everything, not to declare wealth, but to make decisions smooth. There was a fireproof safe sunk into a wall, its metal cool and indifferent. A basket held clean towels folded with a careful economy. He allowed me to sit on a couch with fabric that smelled faintly of resin and pine. He made coffee that tasted like a promise kept, and the aroma settled in my chest the way a lullaby can. He offered me money folded into a single envelope, and a small black card, matte and blank, except for a single name typed in lowercase. He said it was for expenses. I told him I could manage, and he gave a look that flittered across his face like a curtained window. He said, "You can try to manage, and you will fail," and that was not cruel. It was accurate. The boy was asleep in a fold-away bed down the hall, and when I saw him next, he blinked awake and called me by a nickname only I used. When I watched them together, the man and the child, the stranger became a silhouette that softened at the edges. He watched the boy reach for the stuffed fox, and his hand rested on the sofa, thumb rubbing in a small, absent gesture that felt like prayer. There were rules he set without explaining. Do not open the door to anyone without telling him. Keep the windows locked. Do not go to the docks alone. They were curfews of a different sort, a map of boundaries that somehow made the apartment feel smaller and safer at once. I learned names quickly in that world, because names there were practical things. He was called Marco by those who dared speak in the open, and there were whispers that added the word capo in private. Lila, the logistics woman, had a brother in shipping who survived an accident because Marco had taken interest. A man named Jonah delivered files and owed Marco favors that tasted of old loyalty. An older woman called Mara kept the books with a smile that could also be a razor. There was an on-call driver, Sam, who took no nonsense and wore the expression of someone who had seen too much at 2 a.m. There was also a soft-voiced lawyer named Elliot who came by once and sat at the kitchen table, making notes about paperwork and protections the way a priest writes in a ledger. These people filled the apartment with movement and purpose, not charity. They each had a role to play in a machine whose purpose included my safety. Life under this arrangement was like being inserted into a roudel, a body of protection where each part had its place. They guarded not out of blind devotion, but because their interests were woven with Marco's. The first month was a lesson in exchange. Protection came with a ledger that made obvious the cost. I was fed, lodged, clothed, given access to money and a network that could bury threats under 1,000 small transactions. In return, he asked for precision in my behavior. I found myself answering his calls without hesitation, learning the tone he used when something mattered and when it did not. My independence, which had always been a weather vane I trusted more than any person, began to feel like a weight I could not carry. I resented the patronage even as my pulse slackened under it. There were nights when I would wake and find him sitting in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, hands clasped around it like a talisman, waiting. He did not sleep poorly. He slept methodically, his rest a schedule rather than a surrender. One night, as rain made the city a living thing, I asked him why he had stopped someone from touching me in a place where many pretended chivalry. He looked at me then, and for the first time his voice lost that corporate quiet. He said that some things were not tolerable within his territory, even if the cost of tolerance could be paid. He did not explain where his line had been drawn or how it had been enforced before me. He only said, "I am not willing to let you become an offering." Those words landed on me in the gray lead of early morning, and I felt something inside me that had become a scar finally close. There were moments of tension that arrived without warning, natural as weather. The first came when a man with a flat voice and ink smudges on his hands tracked me to the grocery store and slipped a note into a bag of oranges. I read the handwriting in the lighting of my kitchen, my pulse doing a staccato song. The note demanded that I return to a debt or that things would be rearranged. It was small and precise and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. I showed the note to Marco, and he folded it between his fingers like a sacrament. He called a council that night. Jonah, Mora, Leela, and Elliot gathered in the living room and spoke in codes softened to conversation. There were 3 paragraphs of discussion that clarified options and costs. Marco made a plan, quiet and sure, that sent the ink-handed man a clear message through channels I did not know were still active. The man vanished from my life as if erased. The second came at a public benefit dinner where my ex decided to embarrass me for sport. He mentioned the boy in a joke, and the room blinked like a bird. I felt reflexively for the sticker on my wrist and found it missing. The stranger reached across the table and covered my hand with his, squeezing until my knuckles creaked. There were nights when I would wake and find him sitting in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, hands clasped around it like a talisman, waiting. He did not sleep poorly. He slept methodically, his rest a schedule rather than a surrender. One night, as rain made the city a living thing, I asked him why he had stopped someone from touching me in a place where many pretended chivalry. He looked at me then, and for the first time his voice lost that corporate quiet. He said that some things were not tolerable within his territory, even if the cost of tolerance could be paid. He did not explain where his line had been drawn or how it had been enforced before me. He only said, "I am not willing to let you become an offering." Those words landed on me in the gray lead of early morning, and I felt something inside me that had become a scar finally close. There were moments of tension that arrived without warning, natural as weather. The first came when a man with a flat voice and ink smudges on his hands tracked me to the grocery store and slipped a note into a bag of oranges. I read the handwriting in the lighting of my kitchen, my pulse doing a staccato song. The note demanded that I return to a debt or that things would be rearranged. It was small and precise and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. I showed the note to Marco, and he folded it between his fingers like a sacrament. He called a council that night. Jonah, Maura, Leela, and Elliot gathered in the living room and spoke in code softened to conversation. There were 3 paragraphs of discussion that clarified options and costs. Marco made a plan, quiet and sure, that sent the ink-handed man a clear message through channels I did not know were still active. The man vanished from my life as if erased. The second came at a public benefit dinner where my ex decided to embarrass me for sport. He mentioned the boy in a joke, and the room blinked like a bird. I felt reflexively for the sticker on my wrist and found it missing. The stranger reached across the table and covered my hand with his, squeezing until my knuckles creaked. The gesture was small and fierce and contained a warning that settled in the room like rain. People who had been comfortable before retreated into better manners. The third moment arrived like a bruise in the form of a message left under our door. A small package of bullets and a single playing card, a red ace. It sat on the mat like a promise. Marco called his people, and in the morning he left the apartment and did not return for a day. He came back with a face like a landscape altered by fire, and a single sentence in his mouth. He told me we would leave the city for a period of time. He made the move without dramatics, with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with tenderness. The cost of that move would be felt in ways I had not foreseen. Backstory settled into the apartment like a photograph on the wall. I carried mine in a pocket of memory so worn it might have been a coin. I had grown up with the small, bright heat of rebellion, taught to survive by a mother who could not name safe men, and a father who had named danger as a job. The house I left was never finished, and my hands learned to make do. I had been 18 the first time I left home, and I had learned quickly that the world would price me according to scarcity. Supporting the boy had been a patchwork of shifts at a diner, and freelance hours answering messages for a law office that never paid on time. The sticker on my wrist had been an afterthought at first, a cheap thing given at a shelter as a way to keep track of intake. It turned into a talisman, a record of each time I stepped from the safety of a small life into an unknown. I had dreams of a quiet life, of a little apartment with plants, and a job that smelled of paper and coffee, not of courtrooms and high collars. Love had not been part of the plan. I had loved in small ways, brief flares that did not last the night. My ex had been a lesson in how charm can be weaponized into expectation, and the departure from him felt like the slow extraction of a splinter. There was, in my past, a classroom of small betrayals that taught me to watch for weather in other people's faces. Marco's backstory was a different ledger. He had been born into a family that measured power like inventory, taught the value of silence as a currency. He had not grown comfortable with tenderness because tenderness could be leveraged against you. He learned early that strength is not always a shout. Sometimes it is the insistence of a quiet presence. He had lost a brother when he was young to an assault that left the family map altered in ways that could not be repaired with apologies. He had become an organizer, not out of hunger for title, but as a way to gather the scattered pieces of a legacy that might otherwise be used against those he cared for. He did not romanticize the means by which he maintained his territory. He knew that someone would pay. He accepted that, but he was careful about who it would be.
People called him Alpha sometimes, in the way one calls a lighthouse, with gratitude and a little fear. Yet there were moments in his past that refused the myth. Moments where he sat in a truck at night and watched city lights like a man counting the cost of the world. He had made choices he would not explain, and foregone many gentle things. There was a photograph tucked in a drawer, faded and unremarkable, of a young man laughing with a small child on his lap. He kept that photograph in a wallet that smelled faintly of tobacco and lavender. That photograph explained nothing formally, but it explained everything informally. Marco protected because he had been protected before, in a way that left him with an intolerance for those who preyed on weakness. Days grew into a routine that had the shape of domesticity but smelled faintly of negotiation. I learned to make a list of things to ask before bed, items that struck a chord between autonomy and safety. Lila orchestrated deliveries. Jonah handled enforcement when it was needed, and Elliot wrote containment orders in language that sounded perfectly legal in the daylight. Mara organized finances, and Sam made sure the vehicles were ready. Occasionally, a man in a suit would arrive to apologize that Marco could not attend a dinner and leave a carved wooden object on the table, a small offering of respect. The boy, who I will call Noah because that is what he had started answering to, fit into the apartment in small ways. He stacked his toys unevenly and left crumbs that Marco would sweep without comment. He took to making tea for people with hands too young to manage a kettle, and Marco watched him do it like a king watching a new plant grow. There was no immediate romance in those mornings, not at first. There was an arrangement, a mutual orbiting, as if two small planets had settled into a common revolution. I resented the tether at times, the way my agency was given a price, and the price paid out in small, invisible shifts. Yet when I watched Noah laugh at something insignificant, I felt a protectiveness that was both mine and not exclusively mine. Marco recognized that protectiveness, and he did not mock it. He reinforced it. He taught the boy to fish in a small pond outside the city, a place I had once liked for its loneliness, and the three of us ate the catch with our hands and warm bread. Tension returned in 3 waves that folded the apartment into its past. The first was the arrival of a man named Calder, rough-spoken, and known for collecting old debts. He appeared at dusk and announced himself with a voice full of gravel. He claimed that a shipment had been tampered with and that Marco owed restitution. Marco listened, then arranged a council. There was an argument and a plan that involved a meeting on neutral ground. He went alone into an oil-lit warehouse with Jonah shadowing 2 steps back, and returned with a cut to his hand and a promise that the matter was settled because of a card Marco left under the table.
Calder avoided the apartment after that. The second wave was an internal leak. Someone on the inside had been sharing movement lists with runners in the port. Marco suspected a person who sorted paperwork, an underling with a quick temper and a long memory named Ravi. He set a quiet trap, using Mara to administer false ledgers and Elliot to draw up papers. Ravi was confronted in a stairwell, and we watched from behind a door as Marco spoke to him in low tones that joy and pity could not disguise. In the end, Ravi left with a bag of money and a face that had been cleared in exchange for silence. The third wave nearly broke the fragile peace. My ex returned with men behind him who were not amused by loss of face. They circled the building one night and left a message on the door, a photograph of Noah taken through a window. It was a clean image, and it smelled of calculation. Marco reacted like a man who had been waiting for the moment the chessboard closed. He moved with a precision that emptied rooms. He arranged for the boy to be moved to a secret location and told Leela to take a different route to work. I wanted to go with Noah, but Marco folded me into a chair and said quietly that my panic would be a beacon. He did not say please, he said trust. I did. The confrontation that followed was not cinematic in the way movies teach. It was a series of small strikes, a negotiation of presence and absence. We staged a meeting in a parking garage with neutral men in the middle, who expected to be paid to see justice enacted like theater. There were terms and counters and the ferrying of a briefcase that smelled faintly of new leather. The men who had followed my ex were good at bluster. Marco was quieter. He offered him a proposition in a room that smelled of oil and concrete. The proposition was not an offer of friendship. It was a ledger done in degrees of safety, consequences, and an exchange that would leave everyone with something measured. The men left with faces that had been pacified, but the victory felt fragile and expensive, like a repaired glass with many cracks. We returned home to an apartment that had been scrubbed and a table set for 4, the ritual of normalcy becoming an act of defense. I began to feel a strange, painful freedom in the margins. He taught me to keep a pistol and then taught me how to hold it like something that required respect rather than a talisman. He taught me how to query a ledger and how to watch men for signs of lying. He taught me without grand speeches, by bringing small instructions and watching if I followed. There were nights when we talked until late about nothing and everything. He chose his words like tools, careful and calibrated. He asked me about the sticker and what it had meant to me, and I told him the story of the shelter and the way it had felt to be catalogued. He listened as if to a confession. He did not laugh. He said that the sticker was a trivial thing for him to amend, but that I was not trivial. That assertion landed like a hand on a shoulder. We began to share small rituals. He learned to make my coffee the way I liked it, and I taught him how to loosen the knot in his tie with one hand. There were intimacies in tasks rather than proclamations, and they fit together like a makeshift family. Noah started to call him Protector as a joke, and the joke stuck because it fit. There was a confrontation I had tried to prevent. I had been prying into a file that Elliot left on the kitchen table, trying to understand the legal scaffolding around Marco's operations, the things that made his world plausible. I wanted to be able to argue for my limits and the boy's schooling without sounding naive. Elliot caught me and asked why I needed to know. I told him the truth, that I wanted to be more useful than I had been. He smiled a small, understanding smile and said that knowledge could be a weapon if tempered. That night, 2 strangers arrived at the apartment in the rain. Men who had been contracted to take a package and had caught the mistake of their lives upon arrival. They were not interested in conversation. They moved with a muscle memory that forced the 3 of us to react. Marco stood between us and them. He did not act like a man who loved me in the way that made things safe gently. He acted like a man who measured risk and eliminated it. He moved in a way that is economical and precise, placing bodies and threats into calculations that leave no room for theatrics. There was a sound of bodies against plaster and a glass breaking. It was over in seconds that feel long in memory. Afterwards, in the quiet where sweat and cigarette smoke lingered like ghosts, he walked into the bathroom and returned with a towel and a look that asked nothing of me but gave me everything. He wrapped the towel around my shoulders and said very quietly that he regretted the cost but not the decision. That was the shape of our protection, not a shield that made the world disappear, but a force that rearranged it to our favor. There were days of tender banality. Noah learned to whistle, a small off-key thing he practiced by the sink. Leela taught me how to alphabetize a pantry in a way that felt almost sacred. Jonah would send small texts with pictures of tools and make jokes about the state of my baking, which was amateur night by his standards. Maura brought in a loaf she had made and asked about my childhood home without pressure. Sam delivered groceries and sometimes stayed for tea. Elliot sometimes paused to read a paragraph from a book he liked, his voice surprising and soft. We built a life that looked like a family created by design rather than blood.
The boy started school again with a patchwork of documents that Elliot had smoothed into place. He came home with stories about teachers and a classmate named Marco, who everyone thought was cool because he had a steady grown-up who picked him up from practice. The small lies we told were for safety, but the truth that formed between us was of a different texture, something made of habit and concern. I found myself sleeping better in a bed that did not belong to me 2 months ago. And that admission felt like surrender and salvation in equal measure. The leak came back one time as a test. A journalist with a chip on his shoulder and curiosity in his eyes rang our bell and wanted a story about the man who had become a myth. He had a list of names and a recorder he clicked in a room too bright. It was a test because whoever had sent him was trying to provoke a public reaction from Marco. We handled it by being boring. Marco handed the journalist a bland statement about community support and infrastructure. He did not raise his voice. The journalist left with a photograph and an opinion that would not rock the first page. Later, at night, Elliot said that the attempt had been amateur, that someone wanted to stir the waters without understanding our depth. Jonah laughed softly and said that it was better that way. It means the caller had small money and large panic. These moments were small, discrete problems that Marco and his team solved with the economy of a well-drilled crew. The largest rupture arrived when Noah, in an act of childish stubbornness, wandered out to the building envelope to retrieve his toy fox that had been knocked off a windowsill. He had been gone for less than 10 minutes, and I had the sense that that was all the world needed to rearrange my schedule. The fox was sitting beneath a car, damp and smelling of engine oil. Noah, cheeks streaked with tears, ran into the street after it, and a delivery truck braked hard. A man in a uniform cursed loudly, and the driver of the truck leapt out, voice raised like a blade. I saw the incident from the kitchen window and felt time compress to a single breath. I sprinted out and pulled Noah out of the path of danger. The driver was shaken, and after a heated exchange, he apologized and left.
But the image of a child in the road was one that travels into a person's bones. Marco came home then and saw me with Noah in my arms, hair damp with sweat from running. He moved without words and took both of us inside and held us there like an offering. That night he told me that something had to change. He proposed that we leave the city altogether for a safer location, a house in a coastal town that he owned under an innocuous company name. He said it with the same precise patience he used when arranging his finances. I looked at him and felt gratitude and grief braided together. We left in the middle of the night with the hush of a moving story.
Leela arranged the transport, and Sam drove us in a van that smelt like lemon and engine oil. Jonah rode in the rear with boxes of things labeled only by Marcus with shorthand that meant little to me. We went to a house that was less ostentatious and more like a bastion. It sat on a cliff with the ocean and immensity of noise below. The house was white with peeling paint at the eaves and a porch that creaked like someone clearing a throat. The air there tasted of iron and salt, and the entire property had fewer eyes on it. For the first time since the lounge, I allowed myself a breath that felt like a horizon. We settled into a new rhythm that included walks on a beach where Noah threw stones and laughed at their splashes. Marco learned to drive a small truck and hated doing it. He made tea in an old kettle that whistled like an argument. He found a small garden that had been left to the weather and began to tame it with the same economy he used with people. He was not a man who softened under the weight of love. He became a man who made choices small and constant enough to be sustainable. There were 3 tension moments during our time at the coast that crystallized what we had become. The first occurred when a man from the city appeared at the porch with a camera and took pictures of Noah playing in the sand. Marco found him wandering the path toward the cove and told him to leave. The man pleaded he had only been taking pictures for an article about coastal restoration, but Marco noticed the smell of a cigarette that matched a brand used by the men from the city. He escorted him to the boundary and left him there with a warning that felt like a compass. The second moment was when a boat arrived at the bluff and 3 men unloaded crates with a stealth that indicated they thought themselves invisible. Marco watched from behind a dune and later confronted them on the dock in a conversation that was short and decisive. The men left with their crates, and one of them kept glancing toward Marco as if calculating the cost of his choices. The third was a storm that blew the roof tiles off a shed and sent a leak into the boys' room. The storm itself was an act of catastrophe, and it tested our domestic competence. We worked as a team to secure the place, hauling tarps and nailing reinforcements. Afterwards, exhausted and sodden, we lit a candle and ate takeout, and Noah fell asleep on Marco's chest. In that moment, everything that had been arranged and purchased and fought for condensed into a simple human tableau. Love did not arrive as a lightning bolt. It was an accumulation of small, ridiculous things. Marco once complained about the way I folded towels, and then later he replicated my method because he had discovered it made the linen shelf look like a small victory. I taught him how to coax a stubborn plant into growth, and he taught me how to sit with silence without filling it with apologies. He was not a man who softened under the weight of love. He became a man who made choices small and constant enough to be sustainable. He kissed me for the first time over the sink when we were scraping a baking dish, and it was awkward and careful and made of an assembly of choices rather than passion. We argued about power. I accused him of wanting to carve me into something safe and domesticated. He accused me of wanting to act like stakes were not being set beneath us. We both were right in parts. He said to me one night that protection is not love alone. It is an architecture we both inhabit. He said that sometimes the truest kindness is to accept being held in a way you would not choose for yourself if you only thought of pride. I said that kindness felt like a cage sometimes, and he kissed the inside of my wrist where the sticker had been, and said the cage offered with a key, and that key was always his hand if I wanted it. We rebuilt ourselves in the little town, with a community of neighbors who were indifferent to our past but curious about our generosity. Marco donated to a local clinic, quietly and without announcement. He hired local men to fix the fence and paid them more than he needed to. He made friends with a woman named Hattie who ran the bakery and who taught Noah how to shape dough into stars. He attended a town council meeting one evening with a calm that dismantled suspicion. Jonah came down for holidays, and Mora visited with chairs and bedding to straighten our lives. Leela stayed back in the city to manage the operations, and would call, making sure that we were not slipping into naivety. Elliot sent letters that contained legal buffers, and a note at the end that said, "Take care." The boy thrived because he had space. He learned to swim in the bay and would return dripping and triumphant, all teeth and grit. Our life felt fragile and real, a construct of vigilance and laughter. There was a final confrontation that arrived like a test of how far we had come. A man from my old neighborhood arrived in the town with a grudge, and a message that suggested an unresolved negotiation. He smashed up a restaurant window in the dead of night and left a note plastered to the door with a name my ex once used in an insult. The town was small, and the police had only so much reach. Marco went to the scene, sleeves rolled, and spoke with the officer on duty. He did not threaten the town. He offered assistance in a way that did not look like domination. He said that it was in his interest to see the town safe, quietly buying the cooperation of a community that had been skeptical at first. The man who had caused the damage left the town a day later with an offer to work somewhere else, moved on by a combination of direct conversation and financial persuasion. There was no grand violence. Instead, there was containment and the economy of favors, the exchange of resources for quiet. The town responded not with awe, but with a practical gratitude, and that reaction recalibrated us both. 6 months from that first night in the lounge, we had a small ceremony in our backyard where we hung lanterns and ate fish that Noah caught with a line he had learned to cast. The town had come, Hattie with her pies, Jonah with his quiet jokes, Mora with a cake so sweet it could make grown men tear up. Leela had flown in and brought a ridiculous scarf because she thought the occasion called for it. Elliot sent a short note that read, "Congratulations," and advised humility. We did not call it anything formal. We were not pretending to be something we were not. But we stood together under lamplight, the wind carrying the smell of ocean and pine, and I felt a steadying in my chest. The man who had been a stranger had become a place. He had taught me the architecture of protection, and then, eventually, how to erect parts of it myself. Years later, when the boy would be older and able to understand the small ethics of our choices, he would ask me why we had not left sooner or why we had chosen the path we did. I would tell him the truth, that fear makes people do strange things, but sometimes fear can also guide you to people who hold their hands open in a way that is honest. I would tell him that the sticker on my wrist had once been a map of the nights I chose to survive, and that it had become, in the hands of a man who knew accounting for cost, a relic of a life I had been given back.
The last image I keep is of Marco at the kitchen table, head bent over a cup of black coffee, the light making a small halo around his hair. He looked up at me and smiled, and it was neither smug nor triumphant. It was domestic and complicated and real. He set the cup down, his fingers leaving a ring of coffee on the table, like a badge, and he said simply, "Keep them safe." I handed him the little painted star Noah had made, and he taped it to the fridge like a secret treaty. The world beyond our gate remained full of negotiations and shadows, the kind of things that require constant tending. But inside our house, the smell of pine and lemon and slow cooking persisted. We ate together, argued occasionally, loved in a manner that included hard choices. The stranger I had taken the hand of was no longer unknown to me. He had a name and a set of responsibilities, and I had a small family that owed him nothing and everything. The price had been counted and found costly, and still we paid, because there are things worth the cost. If someone asked me now whether I would take his hand again in that lounge, I would not hesitate. The answer would be yes, even knowing the ledger that would follow, because the alternative would have been walking alone. If you were in that room and had to choose, what would you do? Would you step into someone unknown to save a life, or would you stand and calculate the cost of freedom? If you want, write only protect or fight in the comments, and tell us in one line why each.
Your respostas ajudarão a guiar se esta história retorna à cidade ou resta aqui perto do mar. Agora, veja o que meu escolho fez depois e como uma família encontrou seus pés no lavo de perigo e cuidado.